300 years before Corporal Marin Aldrich was born, a princess of the Vathani sovereignty swallowed a capsule of slow-acting poison on the morning of her arranged binding. The histories recorded it as a diplomatic tragedy. The truth, preserved only in a single intercepted military communiqué declassified 2 centuries later, was simpler. She had asked to choose her own consort, had been refused, and had decided that oblivion was preferable to a life of ornamental silence. The sovereignty sealed the record. The name of the princess was struck from the genealogical archive. But the law she had died protesting, the binding decree, which forbade Vathani royals from selecting consorts outside the approved lineage registry, survived her by 3 centuries, and was still in force on the night Marin Aldrich first saw Princess Eshana Ray standing at the edge of a cliff in the rain, deciding whether she had the same courage her ancestor had found. He did not know any of that yet. He knew only that someone was standing too close to a 200-meter drop in a thunderstorm, and that his duty rotation had placed him on perimeter watch along the northern ridge of Camp Tessera, and that the figure silhouetted against the lightning was too tall and too still to be human. Marin crossed the ridgeline at a controlled jog, his boots finding purchase on wet stone by instinct. The rain hammered his patrol jacket flat against his shoulders. His rifle stayed slung. Whatever was happening at that cliff edge, it was not a tactical problem. The figure turned before he reached her. In the next flash of lightning he saw her clearly. Vathani, 7 feet tall, her skin the color of winter sky, pale blue-gray, luminous even in the dark. Her ears tapered to narrow points beneath hair the color of storm clouds, plastered to her skull by the rain. Her eyes were enormous, dark as wet obsidian, and they fixed on him with an expression he recognized from years of border postings and refugee corridors. It was the expression of someone who had stopped expecting help, and was startled to find it arriving anyway. She wore a traveling cloak over what had once been fine clothing, now mudded and torn. No jewelry, no insignia, nothing that said princess, nothing that said anything except a woman a long way from wherever she was supposed to be. "Ma'am," Marin said, his voice was steady. That was training. His heart rate was elevated. That was the cliff. "You're standing on an unstable ledge in an electrical storm. I'd like you to step back about 3 meters. She stared at him. Rain ran down her face. Then she looked back at the drop, and something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not disappointment, but something closer to the look of a person who has just been interrupted in the middle of a sentence they were not sure they wanted to finish. She stepped back. Marin exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath until the air left him in a rush that the rain covered. He unclipped his patrol poncho from his belt and held it out to her. It was sized for a human and would cover her to mid-thigh at best, but it was waterproof and she was shaking. She took it without a word. Her fingers were long, blue-gray, and colder than the rain. "There's a medical shelter 200 meters south," he said. "Heated. I can walk you there." "I am not injured," she said. Her voice was low, precise, accented in the way all Vathani spoke Galactic Common. Every consonant landed like a stone placed with deliberate care. "You don't have to be injured to be cold," Marin said. "The shelter has a heating unit and a bench. You can sit until the storm passes." She looked at him again. The lightning had moved east and her face was half shadow now, but her eyes caught what little light remained and held it. He could not read her expression. He was not sure she wanted him to. "What is your name?" she asked. "Corporal Marin Aldrich, 3rd Human Expeditionary Guard, posted to Camp Tessera under the Joint Border Accord." "You are a soldier." "A guard, perimeter watch, the exciting stuff," he gestured south. "The shelter's this way." She followed him. They walked without speaking through the rain, and Marin kept his pace measured so she would not have to hurry. Her stride was longer than his, but she was moving carefully, and he noticed she favored her left ankle. Not a limp exactly, more like an old injury that the cold and the wet had woken up. The medical shelter was a prefab unit bolted to the ridge, one of 6 scattered along Camp Tessera's perimeter for patrols caught in weather. Marin keyed the lock, held the door, and let her enter first. The heating unit kicked on automatically, filling the small space with dry warmth. He pulled out the emergency bench, unfolded it, and set it against the far wall. Then he opened the supply locker and found a thermal blanket, a water canister, and a ration bar. She sat on the bench and pulled the thermal blanket around her shoulders without being asked. When he set the water canister beside her, she drank half of it in a single long swallow, and he watched her close her eyes for a moment, and something in the way she held the canister, both hands, gripping it like it was the only solid thing in the world, told him she had not had water in a while. He sat on the supply locker across from her and waited. "You are not going to ask," she said eventually. "Ask what?" Why a Vathani woman was standing at the edge of a cliff, in a thunderstorm on a human military perimeter. Marin considered this. "It's not really my business. My business is the perimeter, and you were on it, and you were in danger, so I brought you here. Whatever you were doing at that cliff, that's yours." She studied him. Her dark eyes were steady now, and some of the trembling had left her hands. "My name is Eshana Ray. I was 4th daughter of the Vathani High Sovereign." Marin's expression did not change. 4th daughter was a phrase that carried weight in the sovereignty. 4th daughters were the dispensable ones, the ones married off to settle territorial disputes, the ones traded to allied houses to cement alliances, the ones whose choices mattered least to the people making them. "All right," he said. "That is all you have to say. What would you like me to say?" She exhaled. It was not a laugh, but it was closer to one than anything else she had done since he found her. "Every Vathani I have spoken to in the past 40 days has either bowed to me or told me where I am required to stand. You are the first person in 40 days who has simply offered me water." Marin held out the ration bar. "It's not great, tastes like compressed sawdust, but it's calories." She took it. She ate it. She did not complain about the taste, which told him more about the last 40 days than any explanation could have. The storm passed. Marin filed a contact report, civilian, non-hostile, Vathani national, provided shelter per border accord protocol, and forwarded it to his watch commander, Sergeant Davy Lorne, who responded with a terse acknowledgement and an order to escort the contact to the camp's diplomatic processing unit at first light. He did not sleep. He sat on the supply locker with his back against the wall and listened to the wind die and the rain thin to a steady drizzle. And at some point during the night, Eshana Ray fell asleep on the bench with the thermal blanket pulled to her chin, and the tight line of her mouth relaxed for the first time, and she looked like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally been allowed to set it down. At dawn, he walked her to the processing unit. She walked beside him, not behind, and the poncho he had lent her was still draped over her shoulders. She had not returned it. He had not asked. The diplomatic processing unit was a polite name for a room with a table and 2 chairs, and a recording device. Lieutenant Voss, the camp's political liaison, conducted the intake. Marin stood outside the door because that was procedure, and through the thin wall he heard Eshana Ray explain, in that precise and measured voice, that she had been betrothed under the binding decree to a provincial warlord named Torvin Saul, whose previous 3 consorts had died under circumstances the sovereignty had classified as domestic incidents, that she had petitioned the High Sovereign for release from the betrothal, that the petition had been denied, that she had walked out of the sovereign's palace 41 days ago with nothing but the clothes she wore and a travel cloak stolen from a servant's closet, that she had crossed 400 kilometers of contested border territory on foot, alone, to reach the nearest human outpost, because the border accord protocol guaranteed asylum processing for any individual fleeing documented threat. Lieutenant Voss asked her why she had not sought asylum from a Vathani provincial authority. She said, because they would have returned me. Voss asked her what she wanted. She said, I want to not be sent back. Marin did not hear anything else because Sergeant Lorne pulled him off the door and reassigned him to supply depot detail for the next 3 days. The sergeant's expression made it clear that the reassignment was not a coincidence. Marin spent those 3 days hauling crates and recalibrating water purifiers and doing maintenance on the camp's aging perimeter sensors. And he did not ask about Eshana Ray, because asking would have been noticed, and noticing would have been discussed, and discussion would have generated the kind of attention that a corporal on a border posting did not need. On the 4th day, Voss summoned him. The asylum claim is being processed, the lieutenant said. It'll take weeks, maybe months. The sovereignty has already filed an extradition request. We've pushed back under Article 17, but they're pressing. She stays in the camp as a protected person for now, and she's been assigned quarters in the civilian annex. Marin waited. She asked for you, Voss said, by name, as her designated liaison. I found her on the ridge, that's all. I know that. She knows that. But she asked for the guard who gave her water in a storm instead of asking her why she was there, and that's you, Aldrich. So you're her liaison. Check on her twice a day, make sure she has what she needs, file your reports and keep it professional. Yes, sir. And Aldrich. Sir. The sovereignty is not going to let this go quietly. 4th daughter or not, she's a royal. If they send a recovery team, we need to know about it before they reach the wire. Keep your eyes open. Marin kept his eyes open. He checked on Eshana twice a day as ordered, once in the morning, once in the evening. He brought her meals from the mess, because the standard camp rations were designed for human metabolism, and she needed modified protein blends that the medical officer formulated after her first health screening, revealed she was malnourished, dehydrated, and carrying stress fractures in both feet from walking 400 kilometers in court shoes never designed for terrain. She ate what he brought. She drank the water. She did not complain. On the 2nd day, she asked him to sit, and he said he was on duty, and she said she understood, and he stood in her doorway for the remaining 11 minutes of his check-in anyway, because standing in a doorway was not technically sitting, and therefore was not technically a violation of anything. On the 3rd day, he noticed she had arranged the quarters with the precision of someone accustomed to making order out of whatever she was given. The bed was squared. The data pad the camp had issued for communication was aligned parallel to the table edge. The travel cloak, mended overnight with thread she had requested from the medical unit, hung on a hook by the door. There was no disorder. There was also no personality. It was the room of someone who had learned not to leave evidence of themselves in spaces that might be taken away. Marin brought her a second thermal blanket from supply stores, because the civilian annex thermostat was calibrated for human comfort and Vaithani ran cooler. He set it on the bed without comment. She looked at it, then at him and said, "Thank you." The way she said it, as though the word had weight, as though gratitude for a blanket was an unfamiliar muscle she was relearning how to use, lodged somewhere behind his ribs and did not leave. The camp's medical officer, a human woman named Dr. Terry Ashford, pulled Marin aside on the 4th day. "Your contact has 2 stress fractures in her left foot and 1 in her right. Moderate dehydration. Caloric deficit consistent with approximately 6 weeks of inadequate nutrition. She walked here, Corporal, on broken feet, in court shoes, across 400 kilometers of scrubland and mountain terrain." Marin was quiet for a moment. Is she going to be all right? With proper nutrition and rest, yes, but the feet will take weeks. She shouldn't be walking on them at all, and she insists on standing every time I enter the room. Old habit, I think, court protocol. I'll bring her meals so she doesn't have to walk to the mess. Dr. Ashford studied him the way medical officers studied people, clinically, thoroughly, and with an opinion already forming. "You do that, Corporal." On the 5th day, Eshana told him about Torvin Saul's first consort, who had fallen from a balcony. On the 6th day, she told him about the second, who had contracted an illness that progressed with unusual speed. On the 7th day, she told him about the third, who had simply disappeared, and whose absence had been recorded in the sovereignty's civil registry as voluntary departure. 3 women, she said, 3 deaths. And the binding decree matched me to him because his provincial holding borders our northern territories, and the alliance strengthens the sovereign's position in the territorial council. That is what my life is worth, a border adjustment. Marin said, your life is worth more than that. It was the first thing he had said to her that was not procedural, not careful, not measured. It came out the way a stone falls straight down, no arc, no spin. She looked at him and he looked back, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence held something that both of them recognized and neither of them named. On the 10th day, she told him about the walk. She did not tell it as a story. She told it the way a person recounts an engineering procedure step by step, without embellishment, without self-pity. She had left the palace at night through a service corridor used by the kitchen staff. She had taken a cloak, a water flask, and nothing else. The first 3 days, she followed a trade road, walking at night and sheltering in drainage culverts during the day. On the 4th day, she crossed into contested territory, where the trade road ended, and the terrain turned to rocky scrubland rising into foothills. She navigated by starlight because she had memorized the star charts during her diplomatic education. They were the one useful thing, she said, that her education had provided. On the 9th day, her left shoe split along the sole. She bound it with strips torn from her cloak's lining. On the 12th day, a border patrol drone passed overhead, and she lay motionless in a dry streambed for 2 hours until it moved on. On the 20th day, she ran out of water. She found a spring on the 22nd day by following the flight pattern of indigenous avians. She drank from the spring for 3 days, refilling her flask each morning, and her feet hurt constantly, and she did not stop. On the 31st day, she reached the mountains. The passes were higher than she had estimated, and the air was thinner, and her feet were broken beneath her, and she climbed anyway. She climbed because stopping meant being returned, and being returned meant Torvin Saul and a balcony or an illness or a disappearance. On the 41st night, she reached the ridge above Camp Tessera, and she stood at the edge of a cliff, and the rain came, and a human corporal appeared in the dark and said, "I'd like you to step back about 3 meters." Marin listened to all of this standing in her doorway, and when she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You walked 400 kilometers on broken feet." "They were not broken when I started. They were broken by day 9, according to Dr. Ashford. Then I walked 350 kilometers on broken feet. Is there a distinction?" He wanted to say something about courage. He wanted to say something about what it meant that the sovereignty's entire diplomatic and security apparatus had not been able to stop a woman in court shoes with a stolen cloak and a water flask. He wanted to say that the word brave was insufficient for what she had done, but the look on her face told him she did not want praise. She wanted someone to hear it and understand it, and not turn it into something decorative. "No," he said, "there's no distinction." The weeks passed. The extradition hearings ground forward through layers of interstellar legal bureaucracy, and Marin brought her meals and filed his reports and stood in her doorway and listened to her talk about the sovereignty, its rituals, its hierarchies, the way its court functioned as a machine designed to convert individual will into collective obedience. He learned that 4th daughters were educated in diplomacy and court protocol and nothing else, because nothing else was considered necessary for their function. He learned that Eshana had taught herself engineering from contraband data slates smuggled into the palace by a sympathetic tutor, a Vathani mathematician named Drell who had served the household for 40 years, and who had recognized, In the fourth daughter's questions about structural load and circuit design, a mind that deserved better than court protocol. He learned that she could disassemble and reassemble a standard atmospheric regulator faster than he could, which she demonstrated one afternoon when the civilian annex's climate unit failed, and the maintenance team was 40 minutes out and the temperature was dropping. She fixed it in 9 minutes. She used a dining fork and a hairpin. Marin stood in the doorway and watched her hands move with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone who had been solving problems alone for a very long time, and he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature regulation. He filed a maintenance report. He did not file a report about what had shifted in his chest. The sovereignty's extradition request escalated. A diplomatic envoy arrived at Camp Tessera, 3 tall Vathani officials in formal silver robes, accompanied by a security detail that Marin counted at 16 armed personnel. They presented credentials. They presented legal writs. They presented a formal demand for the return of Princess Eshana Ray, 4th daughter of the High Sovereign, who was, they said, suffering from a documented psychological condition that rendered her unfit to make decisions regarding her own welfare. Lieutenant Voss reviewed the writs. The camp's legal advisor reviewed them. The response, delivered with the careful neutrality that human military diplomacy excelled at, was that the asylum claim was still under review and the protected person would remain in camp custody until the review concluded. The Vathani envoy did not leave. They established a temporary diplomatic station 2 kilometers outside the camp perimeter and settled in to wait. The lead diplomat, a tall male named Consul Verk Than, requested a direct meeting with Eshana. The request was denied. He requested a meeting with her liaison. That request was granted because denying it would have been a diplomatic escalation the camp was not authorized to make. Marin met Verk Than in the camp's conference room, with Lieutenant Voss present. The consul was 8 feet tall, silver-skinned, dressed in diplomatic robes that cost more than Marin's annual salary. He looked at Marin the way a person looks at furniture, acknowledging its presence without granting its significance. "Corporal Aldrich," the consul said, "you are aware that Princess Eshana Ray is suffering from a documented psychological condition." "I am aware that the sovereignty has filed documentation to that effect, sir." "The documentation is thorough. Certified by the Royal Physician's Office." "I'm sure it is." "Then you understand that her stated desire to remain here is not a rational decision, but a symptom." Marin was quiet for a moment. "With respect, Consul, the woman I interact with twice a day does not present as someone suffering from impaired judgment. She presents as someone who made a decision and walked 400 kilometers to see it through." The consul's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes tightened. "You are a perimeter guard, Corporal. You are not qualified to assess." "I'm qualified to observe," Marin said, "and my observations are in my reports, which are available to the Arbitration Council." The meeting ended. Voss said nothing until they were in the corridor, and then the lieutenant said, "That was either very brave or very stupid." "Can it be both, sir?" "In my experience, Aldrich, it usually is." Marin doubled his perimeter checks. He ran the northern ridge twice a night instead of once. He checked Eshana's quarters 3 times a day instead of 2, and when Sergeant Lorne raised an eyebrow at the 3rd check, Marin said, "The envoy has 16 armed security personnel within striking distance of the wire, Sergeant. I'd rather check too often than not enough." Lorne studied him for a long moment. Then the sergeant nodded and said nothing, which was the closest thing to approval Marin had ever received from her. On the 32nd day, the recovery team came. They came at 0300 in the gap between satellite passes, wearing sensor-dampening suits that the camp's aging perimeter array almost missed. Marin did not almost miss them. He was on the northern ridge where he had been every night for the past week, and he saw the faint heat shimmer of dampened bodies crossing the ravine below the cliff where he had found Eshana standing in the rain, and he keyed his comm and said, "Contact. Northern Ridge. 6 bodies dampened, moving toward the civilian annex. This is not a drill." The camp woke, floodlights hit the ravine. A response team deployed in under 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes faster than the drill standard, because Sergeant Lorne ran a tight camp, and because every guard in Camp Tessera had been watching the diplomatic station's security detail for a month, and had been privately calculating the odds of exactly this. The recovery team withdrew. No shots were fired. The diplomatic envoy issued a formal protest. The camp's legal advisor issued a formal response. Marin filed his contact report, and Sergeant Lorne read it and said, "Good eyes, Aldrich." Marin went to Eshana's quarters at 0430, outside his scheduled check-in times, because the recovery team had been heading toward the civilian annex, and she deserved to know. She was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of her bed with the thermal blanket around her shoulders and the data pad dark in her hands, and when he appeared in the doorway, she said, "I heard the floodlights. Recovery team, 6 personnel, they're gone." "How close did they get?" "Not close enough." She looked at him. In the dim light of the annex room, her dark eyes were enormous and steady, and the line of her mouth was the line of someone who had spent 41 days walking toward a place where she would not have to run, and who had just been reminded that running might never truly end. "Thank you," she said. "I was on the ridge, it's my job." "You were on the ridge every night this week. I checked the rotation schedule. Your assigned post is the Eastern Gate." "You traded shifts." He did not deny it. There was no point. She was an engineer. She noticed patterns. She noticed everything. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I was not sleeping." "Then go back to sitting in the dark. I'll be on the ridge." A silence, then Marin. "Yeah. The Eastern Gate is warmer. The Northern Ridge has a better sightline." She did not argue. She did not smile. But the tight line of her mouth eased, just slightly, and he took that with him back to the ridge and held it against the cold for the remaining 3 hours of his watch. That was the last calm night at Camp Tessera. The Sovereignty recalled its envoy and escalated to the Interstellar Arbitration Council, which meant the asylum case was now a political crisis, which meant Camp Tessera went from a quiet border posting to the most watched piece of real estate in the sector. Additional human guard units arrived. Media drones buzzed the perimeter. 3 separate galactic news services requested interviews with the princess, all of which were denied. Through all of this, Eshana Ray sat in her quarters in the civilian annex and watched the world outside her window grow louder and more complicated. And Marin brought her meals and stood in her doorway and did not know what to say, because what he wanted to say was not in any field manual, and not covered by any protocol, and would, if spoken aloud, create problems that a corporal on a border posting could not solve. She solved them for him. "You are standing very carefully in that doorway," she said one evening, as the sunset turned the mountain ridge gold and the camp hummed with the arriving energy of the reinforcement detail. "You have been standing very carefully in doorways for 37 days. I'm on duty." "You are always on duty." That is what you say when you want to stay, and do not have a reason that fits in a report. Marin said nothing. He was aware that his hands were still. He was aware that his breathing was even. He was aware that these were the signs of a man exercising control over something that control was not designed for. "The binding decree," Eshana said, "does not only forbid me from choosing a consort outside the approved lineage registry, it forbids any individual outside the registry from expressing intent toward a member of the royal line. The penalty is exile. The purpose is deterrence. The effect is silence." "I know what the decree says." "Do you?" "Lieutenant Voss gave me the full legal briefing when I was assigned as your liaison. I read the decree. I read the amendments." I read the case history, including the classified communique about your ancestor 300 years ago. Eshana's eyes widened. For a moment, the composure that she wore like armor cracked, and beneath it he saw the raw geography of grief that she had been navigating since the night he found her on the cliff. You know about her. I know she died because she wasn't allowed to choose. I know the decree survived her. I know you walked 400 kilometers through hostile territory because you didn't want to be the next name they struck from the record. The silence between them was a physical thing. It occupied the doorway alongside him. Marin, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without his rank. I know, he said, I know. And I am standing in this doorway because if I step through it, everything changes, and I need you to understand that I am aware of that. I have been aware of it since the night I handed you a poncho in a thunderstorm, and you looked at me like I was the first person who had ever treated you like a person and not a treaty clause. She stood. She was 7 feet tall and he was 5'11", and she had to look down to meet his eyes, and he had to look up to meet hers, and the difference did not matter at all. The decree says you cannot express intent, she said. I'm not expressing intent. I'm stating a fact. There is a difference and the decree does not cover facts. What fact? That you fixed a climate unit with a fork and a hairpin, and I have not been the same person since. She did not smile, but the line of her mouth changed, and her eyes, those dark, enormous, steady eyes, caught the last of the sunset light and held it, and something in them that had been guarded since the night on the cliff opened, just a fraction, like a door that had been locked for a very long time and had finally heard the right knock. That is a very specific fact, she said. I'm an observant person. The arbitration council hearings began. They were conducted via secure channel, which meant the lawyers argued across light years while Eshana sat in a room at Camp Tessera and answered questions relayed through a translation buffer that stripped emotion from her voice and delivered her words as flat data. Marin sat outside the room during every session because he was her liaison and because someone should be there when she walked out. And every time she walked out, her face was composed and her hands were steady, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who was holding herself together through an act of will so sustained that it had become a form of architecture. He brought her tea after the sessions, human tea. She had never had it before, and the first time she tasted it, she paused and looked at the cup with an expression that he could not decode until she said, "This is warm, not the temperature, the concept. Something warm offered freely with no contract attached." After the third session, she did not speak for 2 hours. Marin sat on his supply locker. He had moved one from the stores to the corridor outside the hearing room, because standing for 6 hours was a young man's game and he was 34, and he waited. When she finally emerged, her face was the composed mask she wore for the council, but her hands were shaking, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had just been asked to justify her own existence to a panel of strangers, which was, Marin reflected, exactly what had happened. He held out the tea, she took it. They stood in the corridor while the camp's evening shift changed around them, and she drank the tea in small sips, and he did not ask what had been said in the hearing room, and she did not volunteer it, and the silence between them was the kind that holds a person together when speech would break them apart. After the 5th session, Sergeant Lorne found Marin in the corridor with his supply locker and his 2 cups of tea and said, "Aldrich, a word." They walked to the edge of the camp, out of earshot. The sergeant was a compact woman in her 40s with sun-darkened skin and a gaze that could strip paint. "You're doing good work," she said. "Your reports are thorough. Your perimeter coverage is excellent. Your liaison duties have been executed with precision." "Thank you, Sergeant." "I'm not done. The part where you traded shifts to cover the northern ridge every night for the last month, I noticed that on day 2. The part where you sit in a corridor for 6 hours a day with 2 cups of tea and an expression that gives away absolutely nothing, I notice that every day." Marin was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about it," Lorne said. "What I am saying is that careful is fine. Careful is appropriate. But careful is not the same as invisible, and you are not invisible. Not to me, and not to the envoy, and not to anyone in this camp who has functioning eyesight." "Understood, Sergeant." "Good, now go sit in your corridor. And Aldrich, when this is over, whatever it turns into, I expect it to be something you can be proud of." She walked away. Marin went back to the corridor and the tea and the waiting. The hearings lasted 3 weeks. The sovereignty presented its case. The princess was psychologically unfit. The binding decree was a sovereign matter. The asylum claim was an act of interference. The camp's legal team presented the counter case. Documented threat, precedent under Article 17, the testimony of 3 provincial physicians who had been quietly smuggled out of Vethani space by a human intelligence officer Marin had never met and whose name was not in any file he had access to. On the 14th day of hearings, the sovereignty played its final card. High Sovereign Talith Ray, Eshana's father, addressed the council directly. He spoke for 40 minutes. His voice was rich and measured and carried the weight of a man who had ruled an interstellar sovereignty for 30 years. He spoke about tradition, about duty, about the structure that held civilizations together, about the responsibility of daughters to their bloodlines. He did not mention Eshana's name once. Marin watched through the observation feed as Eshana listened to her father speak about her as though she were an abstraction, a legal principle, a treaty obligation, a line item in a budget of dynastic necessity, and he watched her hands, folded in her lap, go white at the knuckles, and he watched her dark eyes hold steady, and he understood that this was what 400 kilometers of walking had been about. Not the warlord, not the deaths. This. The complete, systemic, structural refusal to see her as a person. The council recessed. Eshana walked out of the hearing room. Marin was waiting with tea. She took the cup and held it in both hands, the way she had held the water canister on the first night, gripping it like it was the only solid thing, and she said, "He did not say my name." "No. 300 years, and they still cannot say the names." Marin stood beside her. He did not touch her. He did not step into the space that the decree and the rank and the law and the 240 centimeters of height difference and the entire architecture of interstellar politics had built between them. He stood beside her, and he held the silence the way you hold a bridge, with weight, with patience, with the understanding that the thing being supported is more important than the thing doing the supporting. "I am going to testify," she said. "I know. I am going to say his name, and hers, the princess who died 300 years ago. I am going to say her name, and I am going to say mine, and I am going to say that names matter because they are the difference between a person and a policy." "Good." She looked at him. "Will you be outside the door?" "I'll be outside the door." She testified on the 16th day. She spoke for 1 hour and 12 minutes. She named her ancestor, Princess Vyeth Ray, 4th daughter, dead at 23. She named herself. She named the 3 women who had died in Torvin Saul's household. She named the binding decree, and she named what it was. Not tradition, not duty, not structure, but a machine designed to erase individual will in the service of political convenience. She described what it meant to be a 4th daughter. The education designed to produce compliance, not competence. The hours spent learning to sit in specific postures for specific occasions. The posture for receiving an ambassador. The posture for being presented to a prospective consort like a piece of equipment offered for inspection. She described the day she was told about Torvin Saul not as a question, not as a discussion, but as a schedule adjustment. Tuesday, fitting for ceremonial robes. Wednesday, departure. Thursday, the binding ceremony. Her life catalogued in a calendar, each entry carrying the same weight as a maintenance rotation. She described the 3 dead women, and she did not soften the descriptions, and her voice did not break. She spoke without notes, without pausing, and Marin listened from outside the door and understood that he was hearing something that had been building for 300 years. The accumulated silence of every unnamed princess, every erased fourth daughter, every woman who had been converted from a person to a clause, finally given a voice. When she finished, the council chamber was silent for 11 seconds. Marin counted. The Vathani delegation's lead advocate asked for a recess. The council denied it. The advocate asked for the testimony to be struck as emotionally prejudicial. The council denied that too. The ruling came 4 days later. Asylum granted. The binding decree was declared inconsistent with the Interstellar Convention on Individual Sovereignty. The extradition request was denied. Princess Eshana Ray was free. The word free had a strange weight when applied to someone who had no home to return to, no resources, no standing, and no clear path forward. The sovereignty had already struck her name from the genealogical archive. Her father had issued a formal disavowal. She was, by every measure that the Vathani court recognized, no one. The Human Expeditionary Command offered her resettlement options: a colony on the Outer Rim, an academic posting at a human university that had expressed interest in her engineering aptitude, a quiet apartment on a station far from Vathani space where she could build a life that no one would notice. She considered the options. She sat in her quarters with the list displayed on a data pad, and the thermal blanket she had never returned folded at the foot of her bed, and the empty teacups lined up on the shelf like a timeline of something that no document would ever record, and she considered her options. Marin knocked on her door at 1800, as he had every evening for 63 days. "Come in," she said. He stepped through the doorway. He had been standing in it for 63 days, and the step across the threshold was the shortest distance he had ever traveled and the longest journey he had ever made. He sat on the supply crate across from her bed, the same distance he had maintained on the first night in the medical shelter. Some geometries are instinctive. "I've been reassigned," he said. "The reinforcement detail is pulling out. My unit ships back to the 3rd Guard garrison on Alder Station in 72 hours. She set the data pad down. "I see. Alder Station is a logistics hub. It's not exciting. The food is average. The quarters are small, but the atmospheric regulation is reliable and the people are decent, and there's an engineering workshop on level 4 that the station commander has been trying to staff for 2 years because nobody wants to work in a logistics hub." Eshana looked at him. Her dark eyes were steady, and the sunset through the window caught the pale blue-gray of her skin and turned it luminous. "The workshop needs an engineer," she said. "It does. And Alder Station is outside Vathani jurisdiction." "It is." "And the commute from the engineering workshop to the 3rd Guard garrison is approximately 4 minutes on foot. 3 if you walk fast, which you would because your legs are longer than mine." She did not smile, but the architecture of her expression, the line of her mouth, the set of her jaw, the way her enormous dark eyes held the light, shifted in a way that he had learned to read over 63 days of doorways and teacups and silence that said more than speech. It was the expression of someone who had walked 400 kilometers through hostile territory and had found at the end of the walk not just asylum but recognition, not just safety but someone who saw her. Not a treaty clause, not a fourth daughter, not a name to be struck from a record, her. "I will need to bring the blanket," she said. "It's yours, you never gave it back." "I never intended to." Marin nodded. The silence between them was warm. It was the warmth of something that had been building for 63 days, or 41 days of walking, or 300 years of unnamed princesses. And it was here now, in this room, in this moment, between a human guard who had offered water in a storm and a princess who had crossed a continent to be seen as a person. He did not reach across the distance. He did not need to. The distance had been closing since the first night. one doorway at a time, one cup of tea at a time, one quiet fact stated instead of an intent expressed, and what remained was not a gap but a bridge, and they were both standing on it. 3 minutes, she said. If you walk fast. I always walk fast. I have been walking fast for a long time. Then you'll be early. I'll have tea ready. She picked up the data pad. She scrolled past the colony option, past the academic posting, past the quiet apartment on a station no one noticed. She found the engineering workshop listing for Alder Station, level 4, and she selected it, and the system confirmed the application, and that was it. That was the rest of her life, chosen in a single gesture, the way all the most important things are chosen. Not with ceremony, not with contracts, not with the weight of 300 years of tradition, but with the simple, quiet act of deciding that this was where she wanted to be. Maren stood. I'll file the liaison transfer paperwork. Will there be a form for this? She asked. There's a form for everything. That's the human military. And what will the form say? It will say that protected person Eshana Ray has been approved for resettlement at Alder Station, Logistics Hub, pending assignment to Engineering Workshop Level 4. It will not say anything about tea or doorways or thunderstorms, because forms do not have a field for the things that actually matter. Then perhaps, she said, someone should add one. He walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold, the same threshold he had stood at for 63 evenings, and he turned back, and she was looking at him the way she had looked at him on the first night, when he had held out a poncho in a thunderstorm, and she had taken it, and her fingers had been colder than the rain. Eshana, he said, her name. Not her title, not her lineage designation, not her case number, her name. Maren, she said, his name. Not his rank, not his duty station, not his registry number, his name. The space between their names was the smallest space in the universe. It was the space where 300 years of silence ended, where a decree designed to erase individual will met two people who had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that they would not be erased. He nodded, she nodded, and then he walked out, and the door stayed open, and the sunset poured through the window like something the universe had been holding in reserve for a very long time. The transfer took 71 hours. Maren packed his kit, filed his reports, shook Sergeant Lorne's hand, and received a look from the sergeant that said everything and nothing, and occupied the exact midpoint between military protocol and human understanding. Lieutenant Voss signed off on the liaison transfer without comment, except to write in the notes field of the form. Corporal Aldrich performed his duties with exceptional diligence. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever written in a military form. Eshana packed her quarters in 10 minutes. She had arrived with nothing and had accumulated very little. The thermal blanket, 3 data pads loaded with engineering texts, a travel cloak she had mended with thread borrowed from the medical unit, and a single patrol poncho, human-sized, waterproof, that she folded with the precise care of someone handling something irreplaceable. They boarded the transport separately, military protocol. She sat in the civilian section, he sat in the guard section. The transport crossed 400 light-years of space in 11 hours, and during those 11 hours, Maren sat with his kit between his boots and his hands folded on his knees, and watched the navigation display track their progress across a map of stars that meant nothing to him, except that every light-year was 1 light-year farther from the cliff where he had found her in the rain. Halfway through the transit, a junior guard named Petrick slid into the seat next to him. Aldrich, that Vathani woman in civilian section, see the princess from the hearings, right? Engineering specialist Eshana Ray. I watched the hearing feed. Everybody did. My wife cried. My wife doesn't cry. Petrick was quiet for a moment. My grandmother was from a colony world, Eris 4. Arranged marriages by tradition. She walked out when she was 19, walked 6 days through marsh country to reach the spaceport. When she got there, A dock worker gave her water and a seat on a cargo transport. She married that dock worker 3 years later. Marin looked at him. Just saying, Petrick said. Some people notice what matters. He went back to his seat. Marin did not look toward the civilian section. He did not need to look. He knew she was there. He knew she had the blanket folded in her lap and the poncho packed at the top of her bag and the engineering texts cued on her data pad and the quiet, steady expression of someone who had made a choice and was carrying it forward. Alder Station was exactly what he had described. A logistics hub, not exciting, average food, small quarters. The atmospheric regulation was reliable. The people were decent. The engineering workshop on level 4 had been unstaffed for 2 years and was cluttered with deferred maintenance requests and broken components, and the accumulated evidence of a station that had been functioning without someone who actually knew how to fix things. Eshana walked into the workshop, surveyed the wreckage, and said, "I will need a fork and a hairpin." The station commander, a human woman named Captain Revalun, looked at Marin. Marin kept his face neutral. The captain looked back at Eshana, who was already pulling a panel off the workshop's primary diagnostic console, and said, "You have full access to tool storage, level 4, bay 3. "Thank you," Eshana said, "but I will start with the fork." She fixed the diagnostic console in 14 minutes. She fixed the atmospheric recycler on level 3 in 22 minutes. She fixed the water purification cascade on level 1 in an hour and 7 minutes. By midday, a technician named Goss from the maintenance crew came down to level 4 to complain that someone was doing his job without authorization. He found Eshana elbow-deep in a junction panel, rewiring a circuit that had been patched badly enough to flicker the lights on level 2 every third Tuesday. She did not look up when he entered. She finished the rewire, closed the panel, and said, "The insulation on your tertiary conduit was degraded to 11% integrity. It would have failed within the month." Goss looked at the panel. He looked at Eshana. He looked at Marin, who was sitting on his supply crate drinking tea with an expression that gave away nothing. "Who cleared her for tertiary conduit access?" Goss asked. "I did," said Captain Lund from the doorway. "Nobody had noticed her arrive. And if you can fix the recycler on level 6 that's been making that noise for a year, Specialist Ray, I'll assign you permanent workshop access and add your name to the engineering roster." Eshana said, "What noise?" The recycler on level 6 had a harmonic resonance issue caused by a misaligned impeller blade that had been installed backwards during a maintenance cycle 3 years prior. Eshana identified the problem by ear in under a minute, corrected it in 12, and the noise that 200 personnel on levels 5 through 7 had been living with for a year stopped as though it had never existed. By the end of her first day, Captain Lund had requisitioned a formal engineering contract and a set of quarters adjacent to the workshop, and the station's maintenance backlog had been reduced by 30%. Marin's quarters were on level 5. The walk from level 5 to level 4 took 3 minutes. He timed it on his first evening, then was annoyed with himself for timing it, then made the walk anyway, carrying 2 cups of tea, one human standard and one modified for Vathani metabolism, which the medical officer on Alder Station had formulated without being asked, because the medical officer had read the liaison transfer file and had understood what the file did not say. The station settled into a new rhythm. Eshana became part of its infrastructure the way essential systems become part of a station, quietly, completely, in ways that people only noticed when something worked that hadn't worked before. The maintenance crew, initially territorial, began routing their toughest problems to level 4. Goss, who had complained on day 1, became her most frequent visitor, arriving with broken components and leaving with fixed ones and an expression of grudging respect that deepened weekly. He knocked on the workshop door every evening at 1800. "Come in," she said, every evening without looking up from whatever she was rebuilding. He came in. He set the tea beside her. He sat on the supply crate that he had positioned in the same spot every evening. The same distance, the same geometry, the same quiet architecture of proximity that said everything the decree forbade. They drank tea. She told him about the system she had fixed. He told her about the supply manifests he had processed. The conversation was ordinary. The silence between the ordinary sentences was not. 3 months in, the Vathani sovereignty sent a diplomatic communication to Alder Station. Not a demand, not an extradition request, a communication. It was addressed to engineering specialist Eshana Ray, not princess, not fourth daughter, not a lineage designation. And it informed her that the binding decree had been suspended pending a legislative review, that 4 other fourth daughters had filed formal objections citing her testimony, and that the High Sovereign had requested, not demanded, requested, a private channel to discuss the matter. She read the communication in the workshop, with Marin sitting on his supply crate 3 meters away, and when she finished, she set the data pad down and looked at him with those enormous dark eyes and said, "He used my name. I noticed. It took him 94 days. Some people are slower than others." She held his gaze. The workshop hummed around them, recyclers cycling, diagnostics running, the quiet mechanical heartbeat of a station that was functioning better than it had in years, because someone had finally arrived who knew how to listen to what the machines were saying. "I am going to respond," she said. "I am going to tell him that I am an engineering specialist on a human logistics station, and that I am well, and that I will speak with him on the condition that he speaks to me as Eshana, not as a fourth daughter and not as a treaty clause." That sounds right. And I am going to tell him that I am staying here. Also right. She picked up her tea. She held it in both hands, the same way she had held the water canister on the first night, both hands, gripping it like it was the only solid thing in the world, except that now the grip was not desperate. It was deliberate. It was the grip of someone who had found the solid thing and had decided to keep holding it. "Marin. Eshana. The form you filed, the liaison transfer, there was no field for the things that actually matter." "There wasn't. I think we have been filling in that field anyway, in doorways, in teacups, in poncho lent and never returned." He set his tea down. He looked at her, at the blue-gray luminescence of her skin, at the storm cloud hair she now wore loose around her shoulders instead of plastered to her skull by rain, at the dark eyes that had gone from the expression of someone who had stopped expecting help to the expression of someone who had found it and was no longer surprised by it. "The decree has been suspended," he said. "Yes." "Which means the prohibition on expressing intent is no longer in force." "That is correct." "Then I would like to state, for the record, that I have been in love with you since the night you fixed a climate unit with a fork and a hairpin, and that every cup of tea and every doorway and every 3-minute walk from level 5 to level 4 has been the clearest expression of intent I know how to make." She set her tea down. She stood. She was 7 feet tall and the workshop ceiling was 8, and she filled the space the way a person fills a space when they have finally stopped making themselves smaller. "For the record," she said, "I have been in love with you since the night you stood on a cliff in a thunderstorm and asked me to step back 3 meters, and then offered me a poncho that was too small, and then sat on a supply locker and waited without asking why. I had questions. You had patience, that is rarer." The distance between the supply crate and the workbench was 2 meters. Eshana crossed it. She stood in front of him, above him, always above him, and neither of them had ever cared about the difference, and she extended her hand. Her fingers were long, blue-gray, and warm now. Not cold. Not cold like the rain on the first night. Warm, the way a person's hands are warm when they have been holding tea and fixing machines and building a life in a place they chose. He took her hand. His hand was smaller than hers, rougher, scarred across the knuckles from years of guard duty and perimeter wire. Her fingers closed around his, and the contact was not electric and it was not cinematic. It was the moment a poncho that had never been returned was finally acknowledged as the first honest thing that had ever passed between them. 3 minutes from level 5 to level 4, he said. 2.5, she said. I measured. He smiled. She did not smile. Vaithani did not smile the way humans did, but her eyes shifted, and the dark obsidian of them caught the workshop's overhead light and held it, and the expression on her face was the Vaithani equivalent of a smile, which was subtler and deeper and lived entirely in the eyes. And he had learned to read it the way he had learned to read perimeter sensors and weather patterns and all the other things that required patience and attention and the willingness to notice what most people missed. They stood there, hand in hand, in a workshop on level 4 of a logistics station that no one noticed, and the atmospheric regulation hummed around them, reliable and steady, and somewhere in Vaithani space, a high sovereign was reading a communication from his daughter for the first time in 94 days, and somewhere in a classified archive, a princess who had died 300 years ago had a name again, and somewhere in the quiet field between duty and devotion, a guard who had offered water in a storm and a princess who had crossed a continent to be seen, as a person had found the thing that no form had a field for. The thing that mattered. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. And the door to the workshop stayed open, the way all the doors between them had always stayed open, because some doors are not meant to be closed, and some distances are not meant to be maintained, and some facts stated quietly, in doorways over tea, across the smallest space in the universe, are the truest things a person will ever say.